Hi everyone, welcome back to class. I want to make an addendum to my survey and work for this week. This came out of some conversation that I had with some students in this class, and I wanted to take a deeper dive into one particular part of the text. Again, if you recall this whole passage, 9:35 to 11:1, it starts off with the text that we focused on in our interpretation this week, which was 9:35 to 38, where we have Jesus, a report of what Jesus is doing, and then we see Jesus is moved with compassion because of the nature of the crowd and the plight of the crowds. Jesus asks that the Lord of the harvest would send out more workers. And then we find out in the second part of the larger unit in this section, which is essentially chapter 10, 10:1 to 42, that Jesus calls and names the 12 disciples in 10:1 to 4, including Judas. So don't miss the fact that Judas is named the one who betrays him, which points ahead to what's going to happen. And then from 10:5 to 42, we get the ministry of the 12. And then 11:1 sort of frames this with 9:35 around the ministry of Jesus. And what this framing does is it invites us to compare the ministry of Jesus with the ministry of his disciples. And this particular piece comes to the clearest demonstration in the second subunit of chapter 10, the largest part of it, which is 10:5 to 42, which in the notes have it as listed as causation with comparison and a climax. And I'm going to make an addendum to this. So essentially we have a description of the ministry of the disciples, which essentially where, how they're going to go about doing the ministry, which essentially Jesus empowers them to do the same sorts of things that Jesus did in his own ministry. Again, if we back up, remember from chapter 5 through 9:34, we have Jesus proclaiming the kingdom in word and deed. And Jesus sends out his disciples to do everything that he had been doing up to this point except for teaching. Do observe here in verses 7 and 8 that Jesus doesn't let the disciples teach yet. Jesus withholds the ministry of teaching from the disciples till post-resurrection in chapter 28 at the very end, where Jesus tells them to teach everything that he's commanded them. Now, this is the part that I want to focus on. We have two contrasting portraits of ministry. We have the negative response, and as you work through this, actually it's kind of depressing how negative it is from 16 to 39, and then there's just a couple of verses that deal with a positive response, though it is a good response, and we're supposed to see that as a positive. Now, what I want to suggest here, and I had this as a question last week, is there a cruciality here? And I think the answer is yes. And I want to lay this piece out in terms of a cruciality that would look something like this, with the actual pivotal piece being verses 38 and 39. And so this is going to be 10:16 to 37, and this is going to be 10:40 to 42. Positive response, and negative response. Now, why am I calling that a cruciality and not simply contrast? Well, this is why I've come to this kind of new position that's going to be an addendum to my survey that I'll have to make an adjustment, is that I think these two verses here actually play a pivot or function as a pivot. And what's going on here? Now, this is these verses, and let's look at verse 38 and 39. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And in a sense, that's a concluding remark on the whole issue of this negative response. It leads to something that's descriptive of the disciples. And whenever you have cruciality, you're going to have essentially a cause, and then the pivot in some way is the effect of the first half, and then the pivot itself serves as a cause for the second piece. So what is it that puts a disciple in the position of being able to actually see this ultimate positive response that's going to take place out of ministry? It's the embrace of the cross. Now, verses 38 and 39 are important. This is the first place in Matthew's gospel where the cross is mentioned. Now we have here 10:38. The next place is going to be in another significant passage that we'll be looking at later in the semester, which is going to be 16:24. And then, of course, once we get to the crucifixion materials, the cross is going to show up again in Matthew chapter 26. But these are the places. So why does it show up here? Now, what's also important is the language in 39 about losing one's life over finding one's life. In verse 39, again, it says, whoever finds their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for the sake of it will find it. So we have find links to lose versus lose life, find life. So if we're trying to find a life, we're going to lose it. But if we lose our life, we're going to find it. This is one of those paradoxes of the gospel. And if you have your scriptures, look at chapter 16. Because this is an incredibly significant passage, 16:24 to 28. Again, we'll look at this shortly. But when you get to chapter 16 of Matthew, we have some of the same language again. So verse 16, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Same language that we see in 10:38. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for me will find it. So we have the exact same language that shows up in 10:39 there in 16:25. So it's almost like this is both a foreshadowing and an introduction to this. And so what this pivot seems to do here, where we have the issue of cross versus seeking to find life, is that gospel paradox. And this is what turns it here. This is describing what ministry is going to be like for the disciples, and it's essentially replicating Jesus' ministry, including the idea of crucifixion. Now, if you explore this and if you work with this interpretively, commentators debate whether this is actually talking about martyrdom, should that be expected or not. Now, you can read the cross in several different ways. Clearly, it's talking about self-denial and living your life as though you were carrying your cross, which that image in Roman times wasn't wearing a nice little pretty piece of jewelry that identifies you as a Christian. If you were carrying a cross, you were a dead person walking. That was the last walk you were going to take, and so you were living those last part of your life as though you were already dead. And so what it looks like to me that this is a cruciality is it's describing the responses that the disciples in Matthew are going to run into over against, that could go as far as invites the disciples, how far am I going to be committed to the mission of Jesus? And in this case, to the same extent that Jesus was, all the way to the cross. Now, and also, the very first verse in verse 40 then talks about anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, right? So we talk about hospitality. And so that's the complete opposite of crucifixion. So I think this here sets up as a cruciality, and it's worth just pondering. And if we're going to do some more work, what's the meaning of cross here, and how does cross essentially describe the negative response that the disciples ought to anticipate with taking the gospel out? And then, just as in Matthew's gospel, on the other side of the cross is resurrection and the spreading of the good news and the going. Isn't it interesting then, after mentioning about losing life and the cross, that this positive response anticipates the welcoming of persons carrying the good news and the good news of that. And I think that anticipates, in some ways, the end of the gospel, where Jesus sends his disciples into all the world. So again, this is a little addendum, a little more in depth. Maybe some of you saw this, and this would be a major structure because in this case, even though it works within a subunit, it certainly controls 50% of the material. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm Brian Russell, and it's truly my privilege to be your professor this semester, and I will see you next time.